The Mojave doesn't care if you live or die. That was the first thing Cale Dryden learned when he stepped off the truck at the crossroads outside Barstow. Not a town, not a gas station, just a cracked sign in four directions of nothing. The driver hadn't said a word. Just slowed down, jerked his head toward the door, and waited. Cale had climbed out without argument. You didn't argue with men twice your size when you were 15 and weighed 110 pounds soaking wet. You just got out. You just kept moving. He had been walking for 6 hours. The sun wasn't above him anymore. It was inside everything baked into the asphalt until the black surface shimmered and breathed like something alive, radiating upward in waves that made the distant horizon ripple and dissolve. The sky was the color of bleached bone. Not blue, not white, just a vast, indifferent pale that pressed down on the top of his skull like a thumb. His shoes were disintegrating. They were canvas sneakers he'd pulled from a donation bin behind a church in Barstow 3 weeks ago. 2 sizes too large, stuffed with a wad of gas station paper towels to make them fit. The left sole had separated from the upper and was peeling back with every step, making a sound that was half slap, half scrape against the baking asphalt. Smack scrape. Smack scrape. The rhythm of a boy going nowhere in particular, which was the only destination he'd had for 3 years. Kyle didn't think about Fresno anymore. That was the rule he'd made himself. Don't look back. Don't name the place. Don't give it the dignity of existing in your mind as something real. The foster home was just a smell now, cat urine and stale beer, and the mildew of a bathroom shared by too many people who had all stopped caring. The caseworker was just a voice nasal and tired, reading his name off a clipboard like it was a grocery list item. The system wasn't cruel. It was something worse. It was indifferent. It had long stopped seeing Cale Dryden as a child and started seeing him as a file number, a placement statistic, a recurring line item in a budget that kept getting cut. He had walked away on a Tuesday morning in March. No note, no drama. Just picked up his backpack, a faded blue thing with a broken zipper he'd fixed with a safety pin, and went out the back door while the house was still asleep. 3 years ago, he was 12 then. He was 15 now, though malnourishment and a permanent forward hunch made him read younger. Strangers guessed 12, sometimes 11. He had learned to use that. Small and forgettable was a kind of armor. The backpack rode his narrow shoulders with a familiar weight. Inside, one change of socks, a half-full water bottle that had been getting warm since morning, a gas station road map of California he'd found in a dumpster outside Victorville, a folded emergency Mylar blanket, and a paperback copy of a Louis L'Amour novel with the cover torn off. He hadn't eaten since yesterday. A bag of Fritos half-eaten found on the seat of a bus. That was it. His stomach had stopped making noise about it and settled into a low, constant, hollow ache that he'd learned to treat as background radiation, always there, mostly ignorable. He was not heading anywhere specific. That was the truth he rarely let himself sit with directly, because sitting with it made something in his chest go quiet in a way that felt dangerous. There was no destination. There was no plan. There was only the basic mammalian logic of forward motion. Keep moving, keep breathing. Don't stop in the open, because stopping in the open got you noticed, and getting noticed got you questions. And questions got you a ride back to Fresno in the back of a county vehicle with a social worker who smelled like hand sanitizer and pity. Away, that was all, just away. The highway was emptied in both directions. 2 lanes of black asphalt cutting through a landscape that looked like the surface of another planet, flat cracked, dotted with scrub brush, the color of old dishwater. Creosote and cholla cactus. The occasional dry riverbed cutting under the road through a concrete culvert. A rusted barbed wire fence running alongside the road for miles, serving no obvious purpose. Fencing nothing in and nothing out. Just a remnant of someone's intention, long abandoned. The silence was immense. It wasn't the silence of a quiet room or a library. It was the silence of scale, the silence of a place so large that sound itself gave up and dissipated before it could travel anywhere meaningful. The only things Cale could hear were the smack scrape of his left shoe, the dry whisper of his own breathing, and the faint high creak of the barbed wire fence expanding in the heat. He didn't hear the car until it was already in trouble. The sound started as a high-pitched whine at the edge of his awareness. Rubber losing its argument with asphalt, a tire pushed past the limit of its grip. Cale stopped walking. He turned his head slowly, his neck stiff from hours of forward motion. His eyes were dry and gritty, and it took a moment for them to focus on the black shape moving too fast down the highway behind him. A black Chevrolet Malibu maybe a quarter-mile back. Moving wrong. The rear end swinging wide on the straight road, overcorrecting left, overcorrecting right. The driver fighting the wheel and losing. It had the terrible choreography of a vehicle whose physics had been handed over to momentum and panic, where the person behind the wheel was no longer driving, but simply experiencing what happens next. Cale watched. He did not shout. He did not wave his arms. There was a clinical detachment to the way he processed it, the same detachment that had kept him alive on the streets. Observe first, react second. Never put yourself in the path of something you can't control. The front right tire clipped the gravel shoulder with a sound like a gunshot. The heavy rear end of the car caught the dirt and dug in hard, the suspension bottoming out. The momentum did the rest. The car went sideways, then it went up. It was slow the way catastrophic things always are in the moment of happening. A slow-motion ugliness that the brain registers frame by frame because it cannot process it any faster. The Malibu left the asphalt completely rotating onto its roof with a sound like the world tearing itself open. Shattering glass. The concussive boom of a steel frame meeting the earth at speed. The shriek of metal crumpling inward. It rolled once, churning up a massive fan of pulverized dirt and uprooted sage. It rolled again, the sound-changing pitch as different parts of the frame gave way. 3 full rotations. Then it slammed down on its roof in the drainage ditch that ran alongside the road 15 feet below the level of the highway, and the sound stopped. Then the silence came back heavier than before. A thick plume of brown dust drifted across the 2-lane highway, catching the afternoon light turning golden and opaque. Through it, Cale could see the undercarriage of the Malibu pointed at the sky, 4 tires, a dangling exhaust pipe fluid dripping onto the overheated earth. His stomach tightened into a hard fist. His first instinct was the instinct that years of survival had sharpened into reflex: don't get involved. Turn around and walk the other way. Trouble had a way of splashing onto anyone standing too close. And this kind of trouble-smoking wreck on an empty desert highway came with flashing lights and uniforms and questions and database searches and a boy named Cale Dryden popping up on a runaway warrant out of Fresno County. He took a step backward, then another. But the predatory part of his brain, the part that had learned to think about resources the way a scavenger thinks, always cataloging, always calculating, whispered something ugly and true. People in wrecked cars drop things. Wallets, cash, phones. The centrifugal force of 3 full rolls scattered the contents of a vehicle across 100 square feet of desert floor. He'd seen it once before, a fender bender outside Bakersfield, the driver stumbling and out dazed while her purse lay open in the road. The thought came with a flash of shame that he noted and then filed away. Shame was a luxury. Hunger was not. He jogged toward the wreck, his backpack slapping against his shoulders, his ruined shoe smacking the asphalt in its broken rhythm. The heat radiating from the ground intensified as he descended into the ditch, the earth here still holding the full force of the afternoon sun. The smell hit him before he reached the car, a layered, complex chemical smell. Antifreeze with its sickly sweetness. Hot metal rubber scorched beyond its tolerance, and beneath it all, cutting through everything else with cold precision gasoline. A lot of gasoline. The puddle had already formed in the sandy soil beneath the inverted car, dark and iridescent, spreading in a slow, flat circle toward a cluster of dry cheatgrass 15 feet away. The engine was ticking rapidly, a metronome counting down something Cale didn't want to name. He scanned the ground first. Habit, a hubcap, a cracked side mirror, broken glass glittering in the dirt like something decorative. No wallet, no bag, no loose cash tumbling in the sand. He swallowed against the dryness in his throat, and forced himself to look into the crushed cabin through the gap where the passenger window had been. He expected stillness. He had braced himself the way you brace for something you know is coming, the way he had braced 100 times before for the boot or the backhand. He expected the broken doll stillness of something that was no longer a person. Instead, he heard breathing. Wet, labored rattling, but breathing. Through the mangled window frame suspended upside down by a jammed seatbelt was a girl. She was maybe 18 or 19. Dark hair plastered to her forehead with a mixture of sweat and blood that seeped steadily from a ragged gash above her left temple. Her face was chalk white except for where the blood had tracked, and her lips were pressed together in a thin line of focused, concentrated pain. She was wearing a heavy leather vest over a black hoodie, an absurd choice for the Mojave in July. And for a moment before Cale's eyes processed what the patches on that vest meant, he was simply looking at an injured person. Then the patches resolved. The winged death's head, the stitched red and white rocker partially obscured by the collapsed roof, but enough was visible. Enough letters. The unmistakable iconography that every person who had ever spent time on the margins of American life knew on a cellular level the way they knew not to touch a hot stove. Hell's Angels. Kyle stepped back. Not one step. 2, 3. A cold spike of genuine, unambiguous terror drove straight through the heat and the hunger in the scavenger's calculation. Bikers weren't just trouble. Bikers, this kind of biker with that kind of patch, were a different category of consequence entirely. A street kid caught rifling through a wreck belonging to a one-percenter club didn't get a warning. He got an education in why he should have kept walking. He turned. He took 3 fast steps back toward the highway. Then the girl screamed. It was not a dramatic scream. It was not the kind of scream that belonged in a movie full and clear and carrying. It was a raw, ragged animal sound, the sound of a creature that has just understood the nature of the trap it's in. High-pitched and ugly and absolutely real. Cale stopped. He stood with his back to the wreck, eyes forward, looking at the empty highway and the desert beyond it, and the absolute nothing in every direction. The scream died into a sound that was almost worse, a sustained gasping whimper of pure physical pain. He could hear her trying to breathe through it. Something happened in his chest that he didn't have a name for. It wasn't heroism. He would have been the first to tell you that. It wasn't bravery or nobility or any of the tidy words adults use to describe acts they want to frame as instructive. It was something rawer and more involuntary than any of those things. It was the thing that fires in a human nervous system before the thinking brain catches up, the thing that makes a hand shoot out to catch a falling glass before the eyes have consciously registered it falling. He cursed. He cursed the desert and the highway and the heat and the broken shoe and the girl and her club and whatever series of decisions had brought him to this patch of nowhere at this moment in time. He dropped his backpack in the dirt above the ditch and he went back. The heat near the car was no longer ambient. It had a presence, a physical pressure against his face and arms. The gasoline smell was overwhelming now, coating the back of his throat with something that tasted like copper and burnt sugar. He could hear the fire before he saw it, a low, greedy crackling that shouldn't have been there yet. He looked down. A thin ribbon of blue flame was skating across the surface of the gasoline puddle. It was almost beautiful for the single second before it touched the dry cheatgrass and bloomed into something orange and immediate, and very much not beautiful at all. The fire moved the way desert fires always move, faster than you expect, with a confidence that suggests it has somewhere to be. The girl was still screaming, not the animal scream anymore. Words now. "Get me out," she rasped. Not a plea, a command. Even suspended upside down with blood in her eye and a jammed seatbelt cutting into her collarbone, her voice carried the absolute expectation of being listened to. "Get me out right now." Cale dropped into the ditch and grabbed the passenger door handle. The metal was already hot enough to sting his palm. He yanked. The door didn't move. The frame had crumpled around it, welding it shut with the seamless efficiency of physics. "The belt!" he shouted, pressing his face to the shattered window frame. "Why isn't it releasing?" "Jammed!" She coughed thin gray smoke already beginning to curl into the cabin from somewhere beneath the firewall. The buckle is jammed. It won't click. I've been... Another cough. Her body was trembling not from cold. I've been pulling at it for... Stop pulling, Cale said. You're tightening it. He looked at the belt. The full weight of her body was suspended on it, the nylon strap torqued tight across her collarbone, and left hip every pound of tension pulling the buckle deeper into its locked position. The heat inside the cabin was trapped and building, and the smoke was getting thicker, darker with the acrid chemical bite of burning plastic. I need to cut it, he said. He patted his pockets, both of them, empty as always. He didn't carry a knife. He didn't carry anything sharper than the edge of his thumbnail. I don't have anything to cut with. Figure it out, she said through her teeth. The fire was wrapping around the front bumper now, finding the rubber of the tire with obvious enthusiasm. Thick black smoke poured upward. The chrome trim along the hood had begun to blister and separate. The heat wave that rolled off the car's front end was intense enough to make the air shimmer between them. Kyle turned and scanned the floor of the ditch. Rocks, dirt, scattered chunks of plastic body panel. A section of the car's chrome trim that had sheared off during the roll about 14 inches long. The broken end snapped at an angle that left a serrated, irregular edge that wasn't exactly a blade, but was the closest thing to one currently available in this particular square footage of the Mojave Desert. He grabbed it. The edge opened a clean line across the heel of his right palm. He felt the pain register and set it aside. He went back to the window. Hold still, he said. He pushed his upper body through the window frame, feeling the heat of the cabin wash over him like opening an oven. The smell inside was concentrated, singed upholstery, spilled coffee from a shattered thermos blood, and the intimate smell of a person sweating through genuine fear. He reached across her suspended body. The leather vest was hot to the touch. He found the nylon of the belt at its tightest point just above the jam buckle, and he began to saw. The chrome edge was not made for this. It was blunt and irregular, and the nylon of a modern seatbelt is engineered to be difficult to cut. This is a feature, not a flaw, except in the situation where the seatbelt has become the problem. The metal teeth chewed at the outer fibers of the nylon, fraying them, but the core of the belt held with indifferent structural integrity. Faster, the girl said. Her voice was still hard, but underneath the hardness there was something he recognized. He recognized it because he had heard it in his own voice in the years before he learned to suppress it completely. The sound of someone terrified and refusing to let the terror be the loudest thing in the room. I'm going as fast as I can, he said, and that was true. The flames had reached the firewall. He could feel the heat intensifying on his legs, on the backs of his thighs, where he was pressing against the exterior of the car. The rubber soles of his sneakers were beginning to soften against the hot metal. He sawed harder. The serrated edge of the chrome found a rhythm not clean, not efficient, but cumulative. Fibers parted. The nylon frayed further from the edges inward. His bleeding right hand was slippery, and he kept losing his grip, and each time he recovered it and kept going. Pull down, he yelled at her. Grab the strap above you and put your weight on it. Both hands. She grabbed the belt above her head and yanked her body downward. The combination of the weakened fibers and her sudden redistributed weight created a single point of catastrophic tension, and the nylon gave way all at once with a sound like tearing canvas, a single syllable of mechanical failure, loud and absolute. She dropped. The top of the inverted car, the floor of the cabin, now caught her hard. She hit it with her right side and made a sound that had nothing performative in it, just the pure involuntary vocalization of impact and pain. Come on, Cale said. He dropped the chrome. He pushed both arms through the window, got his hands under her armpits, felt the slick heat of her leather vest and the trembling of her shoulders beneath it. You have to help me. Push with your legs. My right leg. Push with your left. She pushed. He pulled. He planted the softening soles of his sneakers against the lower edge of the window frame and threw all of his 110 pounds backward into the effort, which was not a lot of pounds, but they were all he had. Her head cleared the window frame. Her shoulders cleared. Her hips caught on the bent steering column. "Stop," he said. He shifted his grip, one hand moving to the waistband of her jeans. He could feel the heat on his hands from the metal framing, and the smoke coming through the window was thick enough now to make his eyes water, and his lungs seize on each breath. He heaved, all of it. Every remaining calorie of the half-eaten bag of Fritos from the day before, every reservoir of desperate, terrified effort. His body had been hoarding everything. They came free together. He went backward into the dirt with her weight on top of him, the impact driving every molecule of air out of his lungs in a single compressed rush. He lay there for a moment with no air and no thoughts, just the pressure of her on his chest, and the sound of the fire getting louder, and the grit of desert soil against the back of his skull. Then something in his hindbrain fired, and he was moving, rolling her off him, scrambling to his feet. His lungs found themselves, and he pulled in a breath that was more smoke than air, and coughed it back out hard. "Get up," he rasped. "I can't, my leg." He looked at her right leg. Even through the torn denim, he could see the shape was wrong. Not broken stick wrong, but the wrongness of a limb that had absorbed the kind of force that reorganizes the relationship between bones without necessarily displacing them entirely. He did not discuss it. He hooked his hands under her armpits from behind, and he began to drag her backward up the slope of the ditch toward the highway. His back screamed. The muscles of his arms and shoulders, which had been surviving on insufficient calories for 3 years, sent urgent and detailed complaints to his nervous system, all of which he ignored. Her boots cut 2 parallel furrows through the sandy soil. Her weight was everything his frame was not designed to move. He stumbled twice. The second time he went to one knee and stayed there for a moment, pulling air through his smoke-scorched throat, looking back at the car. The fire had fully engulfed the front half. The paint was gone. The hood was glowing at its edges. The black smoke column was visible from miles away, rising straight up into the windless desert sky. He got up. He kept pulling. They made it to the shoulder of the highway, 30 feet from the wreck, and Cale's legs simply stopped. Not a decision. A system shut down. He sat down in the dirt with no transition between standing and sitting, and for a moment he looked at his hands without processing what he was seeing. The cut across his right palm had been bleeding the whole time. His left hand had 2 knuckles missing their skin. Both hands were shaking with a fine, rapid tremor that had nothing to do with temperature. The girl lay beside him, her chest heaving, her eyes closed, her left hand pressed flat against the asphalt shoulder as if checking that it was real. Then the Malibu's fuel tank went. It was not the explosion of the movies. There was no fireball that climbed into the sky in a neat mushroom shape. There was a concussive atmospheric thump, a pressure wave that pushed against Cale's chest and eardrums, and then a column of oily black smoke so dense and so fast that it seemed to punch through the air rather than rise through it. The heat wave arrived a half-second later, a wall of radiant thermal energy that baked the moisture from Cale's face and dried his eyes in their sockets. He turned his head and watched the Malibu burn. Beside him, the girl opened her eyes. They were a striking pale blue, a color unusual enough that it registered even now, even here. Her face was a geography of damage, the deep gash at her temple still bleeding freely. Dried blood cracked at the corner of her mouth, her eye socket showing the first dark promise of a bruise that would be spectacular by morning. She was looking at the burning car with an expression that was not fear and not relief and not grief, but some compound of all three that didn't have a common name. "Sarah," she said. Cale looked at her. "My name," she clarified, her voice like gravel through a sieve. "Sarah Stokes." He nodded once, still looking at his hands. "Cale," he said. "You're bleeding," she said. "I know." A silence. The fire roared. Somewhere in the distance, a large bird was riding a thermal column, circling with the patience of something that understood how these things tend to go. "Why did you come back?" Sarah asked. The question was direct, unadorned, the question of someone who had been raised in an environment where directness was the only currency that held its value. She wasn't asking for a story. She was asking for the truth the way people ask for the truth when they've already been through enough pretense to last several lifetimes. Cale was quiet for a moment. You stopped screaming for a second, he said finally, and then you started again. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. He didn't look back. That's a strange reason, she said. Yeah, he said. They sat with that. The vibration reached them before the sound did. Cale felt it in the asphalt beneath him, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that traveled through the ground like an approaching weather system, moving up through his bones and settling somewhere in his sternum. He looked down the highway to the west, toward the still blazing sun, and for a moment he saw nothing but the heat haze and the mirage water shimmering on the road. Then they crested the rise. Motorcycles. Not one or two or a dozen. A river of them two abreast, perfectly ordered, stretching back over the hill and out of sight in a column that seemed to have no end. Chrome caught the sun and threw it back in hard, bright flashes. The sound built from a vibration to a hum to a roar that went beyond sound and became something physical, something that pressed against the skin. Kyle scrambled backward. His scraped palms found the gravel and slipped. He got his feet under him and rose into a half-crouch, his eyes cutting left-right, calculating distance to the scrub brush, to the far side of the road, to anywhere that was not here. Years of street-level education in which kinds of attention you absolutely could not afford detonated in his nervous system. He took one step toward the desert, and his ruined left shoe gave way entirely, the sole peeling completely free, and he went down hard on his knees on the asphalt. Not gracefully, not like a stumble, like a thing that had been running on empty and had finally run out. The lead bikes hit their brakes, the scream of tires. The formation broke outward with the practiced efficiency of people who have drilled this surrounding the scene, pulling up on both sides of the highway, shutting down the road in both directions with the complete authority of an organization that has never much cared about traffic law. Engines cut. One after another, the roar reduced itself to silence in a cascade of mechanical clicks and hissing, cooling metal. Boots hit the asphalt. The man who dismounted the lead bike was not large the way that some men are large, the soft, volumetric largeness of accumulated mass. He was large the way that things built to function under extreme load are large, wide across the shoulders, heavy through the chest, a face carved into a permanent topography of weathered intention, mostly obscured by a gray-flecked beard that had never been tended toward anything aesthetic. Dark sunglasses, a leather cut that strained against his frame, the California top rocker vivid in the afternoon light, the Nomad's bottom rocker below it. His boots on the asphalt had a sound like conviction. He didn't run. He walked with a coiled, leashed urgency that was somehow more frightening than running would have been the walk of a man who has learned that moving too fast toward the things that matter most tends to break them. He came down the shoulder of the highway, and he saw the burning car, and he saw Sarah. Something happened to his face that the sunglasses couldn't hide. His jaw set, his chest filled and didn't release. Sarah. His voice was a gravel pit hit by a depth charge. He was at her side in 4 long strides, dropping to the dirt, with his massive knees hitting the ground like stones, his huge hands hovering over her with a precision that had nothing to do with his size, the delicate hover of someone who was terrified that touching her would make something worse. He pulled off the sunglasses. His eyes were pale blue, identical to hers. The exact same shade, the exact same slightly startled quality, except where hers were currently dilated with pain and shock. His were wide with a terror so profound it had stripped away 40 years of cultivated hard exterior and left something raw and fatherly and desperately human underneath. "Dad," Sarah said. Her voice was barely a sound. She reached up with her left hand and found the front of his leather cut and held on. "Don't move," he said. His voice cracked down the middle on the second word. He looked up, his eyes sweeping the scene, the burning car, the twin tracks in the dirt, the shattered window, and then they found Cale. Cale had not managed to get up from his knees. He was still there on the asphalt shoulder, his hands in his lap covered in 2 kinds of blood, watching the scene with the stillness of a very small animal in the presence of very large predators. Around him, the chapter had assembled a perimeter of leather and denim and expressionless faces. Bikers who had pulled their bikes to the shoulder and dismounted, and formed a wall not by instruction, but by long practice. The organic geometry of a brotherhood that moved as one organism. The man's blue eyes locked on Cale. They took him in completely, the scrawny frame, the ruined shoes, the bloody hands, the backpack in the dirt 30 feet away. The father looked at the boy, covered in his daughter's blood. He started to rise. Cale's arms came up over his face. It was not a considered response. It was not tactical. It was the oldest reflex. He had the reflex from the group homes and the street corners and every other place where a large adult moving toward him had tended to mean impact. Arms up, head down, tuck the vulnerable things. It was the posture of a child who had been surprised by pain enough times to stop being surprised by it. He braced. He waited. "Wait!" Sarah's voice small but absolute. "Dad, stop." The man stopped. "He pulled me out," Sarah said. Each word was effortful, dragged up through pain and exhaustion. "My belt jammed. Fire started. I was stuck upside down in there." She paused to breathe. "He sawed through the belt. He dragged me up the ditch." Another pause. "It blew up 10 seconds after we got clear." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. The man's blue eyes moved from Cale to the burning Malibu. They traced the twin furrows in the dirt. They found the section of chrome trim lying where Cale had dropped it dark at one end with the blood from his palm. They came back to Cale, to the melted soles, to the cut hand, to the arms still raised over a face waiting for impact. He stood very still for a long moment. Then his legs went. It was not theatrical. It was not performed. It was the physical manifestation of what happens when the machinery that has been holding a person together, adrenaline and forward motion, and the absolute necessity of function, encounters the truth of what almost happened and simply cannot hold anymore. Abbott Stokes, president of the California Nomads chapter of the Hells Angels, dropped to his knees in the dirt in front of a 15-year-old runaway. The impact of his knees hitting the rocky shoulder was loud enough to be heard by the nearest riders. His shoulders rounded forward, his head went down. He reached out his massive, tattooed, scarred, weathered hands, shaking with a tremor as fine and rapid as Cale's own, and he wrapped them gently with extraordinary and careful precision around Cale's wrists, around the cut hand and the skinned hand holding them like something he'd been handed that he was terrified of dropping. "My whole world was in that car," Abbott said. His voice was barely controlled. There was nothing smooth in it, nothing that spoke of the man who commanded 800 people across 2 states. There was only a father kneeling in desert dirt holding the wrists of the boy who had stood between his daughter and the fire. "My entire life." He bowed his head. His forehead came to rest against the knuckles of Cale's ruined hands. "You gave me my life back," Abbott said. Cale did not move. He did not speak. His arms were still raised, though there was no longer anything to defend against. He was looking down at the top of this man's head, the gray-threaded hair, the weathered scalp, the massive shoulders shaking with something that was no longer rage, and he did not have any framework for what he was seeing. Nothing in 3 years of survival, nothing in 12 years before that had given him a single reference point for this moment. He heard movement. Behind Abbott, a man with half an ear stepped forward. He had been watching the exchange with the attentive, analytical stillness of someone who catalogs everything. He looked at his president, a man who bowed to no law, no court, no authority on earth that he hadn't personally decided to recognize, kneeling in the dirt of a desert highway before a boy with melted shoes. Greer Fallon dropped to one knee. The sound of it carried down the line. The sergeant-at-arms dropped. The enforcers dropped. Down the column of assembled riders in a cascade that moved like water. Finding its level, the men of the California Nomads chapter went to their knees. Not because anyone told them to, because their president had shown them the weight of the debt, and they understood the code, and the code was not complicated. You honored what was owed. The sound of it was extraordinary. 800 men on one knee on a baking desert highway in absolute silence. Kickstands slapping down in a metallic chain that stretched a quarter mile. The creak of leather, the settling of weight, and then nothing. Just the column of black smoke rising from the burning Malibu and the desert in the silence. Cale sat in the center of it. He did not feel like a hero. He did not feel brave. He felt the precise sensation of a body that has spent all of its reserves and is now running on nothing. The particular lightness of complete expenditure, every calorie burned, every reserve tapped. His hands were still shaking. His throat was still raw with smoke. His knees were bleeding through his jeans. He looked at the 800 men kneeling in the dust. He looked at Abbott, whose head was still bowed over his hands. And then his stomach made a sound. It was not subtle. It was not polite. It was the full-throated, hollow, resonant announcement of a digestive system that had been waiting patiently since yesterday's half bag of Fritos and had decided that this was whatever else it was, a moment in which it would be heard. It traveled through the silence of the desert with extraordinary clarity. Abbott lifted his head. He looked at Cale, at the sunken cheeks, at the pale skin stretched over the sharp architecture of a face that hadn't had enough calories in a very long time. A sound came out of Abbott's chest that took a moment to identify a short, wet, involuntary bark of laughter. Not mocking, not celebratory. The laugh of a man whose nervous system needed one valve released before it could process what had just happened. "When did you last eat?" Abbott asked. His voice was still raw, but it had changed temperature. Cale looked at him. "Yesterday," he said. "Half a bag of Fritos." Abbott Stokes looked at this boy, 15 years old, 110-pound shoes, melted to the asphalt, hands cut open, 3 years of nobody written all over him. And he nodded slowly the way men nod when the world has just clarified something important. He stood. He reached down. His hand was enormous. "You're eating steak tonight," Abbott said. His voice was quiet and absolute. "And tomorrow. And as long as you ride with us." Cale looked at the hand. He looked at the sea of men on their knees in the desert dust. He looked at Sarah, who had her eyes open and was watching him with an expression he couldn't read. But that was not gratitude exactly, something more complicated than gratitude, something that had more edges. He looked back at the hand. For 3 years, every instinct he'd cultivated had been organized around a single directional imperative. Every morning was an exercise in forward motion and strategic invisibility. Every kindness came with a bill. Every shelter came with a cost. Every offered hand had a calculation behind it. He had learned this the way children learn things that adults don't intend to teach them, through repetition and evidence and the slow accumulation of proof. The burning instinct to run was there. He could feel it in his legs in the electric readiness of muscles that had been rehearsing flight for 3 years. And then it wasn't. He didn't understand why. He didn't try to. Some things announced themselves not as conclusions, but as facts already true, requiring no argument, simply present. He reached up and took Abbott's hand. The grip that pulled him to his feet was effortless and immediate. The grip of a man who could have lifted him one-handed and probably had lifted heavier things before breakfast. Cale came upright, standing on his melted shoes on the shoulder of a highway in the middle of the Mojave Desert, surrounded by 800 kneeling men in a column of black smoke in the fading heat of a burning car. He breathed out. For the first time in a very long time, the exhale was complete. They put him in a tent, not a camping tent, a canvas structure the size of a small room. Military surplus, by the look of it, with a folding cot and a battery lantern and a plastic water jug that someone had filled and left without comment. Someone else had left a plate. Cale didn't know who. He hadn't seen it happen. He'd been sitting on the cot with his back against the canvas wall, looking at his hands. And then the plate had been there on the folding stool beside him, steak like Abbott had promised. Thick and still steaming, with 2 slices of white bread pressed against the side of the plate and a pile of canned beans that had been heated until they were slightly scorched on the bottom of the pan. He ate the way he always ate when food was available and the future was uncertain. Completely and fast, with the focused attention of someone who understood at a cellular level that the presence of food in the present moment was not a reliable indicator of food in any future moment. He ate the steak with his hands because the plastic fork that had come with the plate wasn't adequate to the task, and he didn't have the patience. He soaked the bread in the juice from the beans. He ate the scorched beans last because they were the part that required the most chewing, and chewing slowed him down. When it was done, he sat with the empty plate in his lap and felt the almost pharmaceutical warmth of a full stomach, a sensation so unfamiliar that his body received it with something close to suspicion. He set the plate down. He lay back on the cot. He did not intend to fall asleep. He was asleep in under 4 minutes. He woke to the sound of engines, not the roar of a moving column, but the more domestic sound of bikes being moved around a campsite repositioned. Their owners settled in for the night. The battery lantern had been turned down to its lowest setting while he slept. Outside the canvas, the light had changed. The savage white of Mojave afternoon had softened into something amber and horizontal, and the temperature had dropped enough that the distinction between the air inside the tent and the air outside was almost pleasant. He lay still for a moment, which was how he always woke motionless, listening, cataloging his environment before announcing himself to it. Years of improvised sleeping arrangements had made this automatic. A toolbox in a Bakersfield garage, the back corner of a laundromat in Victorville, a drainage culvert outside Palmdale that had been surprisingly wind-free. You learned to wake quietly and assess before you moved. The tent was his, no one else in it. He sat up and looked at his hands. Someone had bandaged them while he slept. The cut across his right palm was covered with a strip of white medical tape over a folded piece of gauze, and the knuckles of his left hand had been cleaned and taped individually. He did not remember this happening. He must have been further gone than he realized. The thought made the back of his neck prickle. He couldn't remember the last time he'd allowed anyone to touch him while he slept. He pulled back the tent flap and looked out. The camp had organized itself in the efficient, practiced way of people who had done this many times. Bikes in rows along the highway shoulder. Tents and bedrolls in the flat scrub beyond the shoulder. A fire-controlled, ringed with stones with 4 or 5 men sitting around it on folding chairs and overturned coolers. The burned-out shell of the Malibu was still in the ditch now, just a blackened skeleton, its heat long since absorbed by the desert air. The sun was an hour from the horizon, painting everything in shades of orange and rust. Kyle stepped out of the tent. The nearest men looked at him. They didn't look away. They weren't hostile exactly. Their expressions had more the quality of appraisal, the look of people trying to take an accurate measure of something they hadn't decided how to categorize yet. He was accustomed to that look. He met it with the flat, neutral expression he'd spent years calibrating, not defiant enough to be a provocation, not soft enough to be an invitation. Abbott was not at the fire. Kyle found him at the far edge of the camp, standing alone at the shoulder of the highway, looking down into the ditch at the burned-out Malibu. He was holding a paper coffee cup in one hand. His leather cut was gone, just a gray thermal shirt and jeans, which somehow made him look larger rather than smaller. The last light caught the silver in his hair. Cale stood beside him. They were both quiet for a moment. "She's at the county hospital in Barstow," Abbott said. He didn't look away from the car. Hairline fracture of the right fibula. 4 stitches above the eye. Moderate concussion. He drank from the cup. "She's going to be fine." "Good," Cale said. Another silence. The desert was doing what it did at this hour, cooling rapidly, the heat of the day releasing upward with a kind of urgency as if it had somewhere else to be. "She wants to come back to camp tomorrow," Abbott said. "I told her 3 days minimum." "What did she say?" Something moved in Abbott's face. "Something I won't repeat." Cale looked down at the burned car. In the fading light, it looked ancient, like an artifact, something excavated rather than something that had driven on this road 18 hours ago. "I'm going to need to know where you're heading," Abbott said. His voice was even, not pressuring, just factual. The voice of a man who needed information in order to think clearly. Cale was quiet for a moment. "West," he said, which was true and also essentially meaningless. Abbott nodded. He understood the shape of that answer without needing it explained. "You have people anywhere, no." "How long?" Cale looked at him. 3 years. Abbott absorbed this. He didn't perform shock or sympathy. He just let it land where it landed and adjusted his understanding accordingly. Cale appreciated that more than he would have appreciated any other response. "You'll stay until Sarah gets back," Abbott said. It was not a question. Cale looked at him for a moment. "Okay," he said. That night someone brought him a sleeping bag. Someone else left a pair of boots outside the tent, used leather his size with remarkable accuracy. He didn't know who. No one made an announcement about it. They were simply there when he went back. He picked them up and turned them over in his hands and set them inside and sat on the cot for a long time in the dark, turning them over in his mind the way he turned them over in his hands. He did not know what to do with kindness that carried no invoice. The boots outside his tent, the bandaged hands, the plate of steak left without ceremony. Each one was a small, precise disruption to a system he had spent years calibrating for the absence of exactly this. Sarah came back on the afternoon of the third day. She came in the passenger seat of the chase van, which she made visibly clear she considered an indignity, and she came out of the van on a pair of aluminum crutches that she handled with the aggressive competence of someone who had decided the crutches were going to keep up with her rather than the other way around. Her right leg was wrapped from ankle to knee. The stitches above her eye were black against pale skin, and the bruise that had been promising itself 3 days ago had fully delivered a spectacular gradient of purple and yellow that covered her left eye socket and spread toward her temple. She looked, all things considered, like someone who had rolled a car 3 times and walked away from it. She stopped when she saw Cale. He was sitting on an overturned milk crate outside his tent reading his coverless Louis L'Amour, which he'd recovered from his backpack. He looked up when the van pulled in. He watched her come out. He watched her see him. She looked at him with those pale blue eyes for a moment, the same appraising quality her father had, the same economy of expression, and then she crossed the camp on her crutches with a directness that made the 2 men between her and Cale step aside without being asked. She stopped 3 feet from him. "You're still here," she said. "Your dad asked me to stay until you got back." She looked at him another moment. "How's your hand?" He held it up. The tape was fresh. He'd changed it that morning with supplies from the camp's first aid kit. "Fine." She nodded. She glanced at the book in his other hand. L'Amour. Found it. "Any good? Good enough." She leaned on her crutches and looked out at the camp. The rows of bikes, the men moving around with the easy familiarity of shared purpose, with an expression that was proprietary and complicated, like someone looking at a home they'd been away from and finding it both unchanged and different. "My dad likes you," she said, not warmly, just as information. "I know," Cale said. "That's not necessarily uncomplicated," she said. "I figured." She looked back at him. Something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, but recalibrating. He had the sense she'd come over expecting a certain kind of person and was finding the category didn't quite fit. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "Someone who wanted something." Cale looked at her steadily. "I don't know what I want," he said. "I haven't had enough practice." She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned and made her way back through the camp on her crutches, and Cale watched her go and then looked back at his book, and that was the first conversation between them that had nothing to do with the fire. Greer Fallon had not said a word to Cale. Not in 3 days, not on the highway, not in the camp, not at the fire in the evenings, where Cale had taken to sitting at the outer edge of the gathered men, saying nothing absorbing. Greer was simply always somewhere in Cale's peripheral vision, positioned with the studied casualness of someone who was not accidentally positioned at all, watching without appearing to watch. The half of his left ear that remained gave his silhouette a shape that Cale had learned to identify from across the camp without having to look directly. On the morning of the fourth day, Greer pulled up a chair beside Abbott's at the planning table, a folding table set up outside Abbott's tent with maps and a radio and a logbook, and placed a manila folder on the surface between them. Kyle was 50 feet away. He didn't hear the conversation, but he watched it because he had learned early that the most important information in any environment was not transmitted verbally. He watched Abbott's posture, the way it was open at the start of the conversation, elbows on the table and the way it changed as Greer talked, the elbows coming in the shoulders squaring. He watched Abbott pick up the folder and open it. He watched him look at whatever was inside for a long time. He watched him close it. Abbott did not look up in Cale's direction. Greer did. Just once briefly with an expression that was not malicious and not triumphant, just the expression of a man who had done a job and done it correctly. That afternoon, two men in California Highway Patrol uniforms pulled their cruiser onto the shoulder of the highway and walked into the camp. Kyle saw them from his tent. He was on the cot, boots on, bag packed. He'd repacked it when he saw the cruiser slow down, a reflex as automatic as breathing. He sat with his hand on the strap and he listened. The voices were too far away to make out words, but the cadence was clear. The formal procedural cadence of an official inquiry and the shorter, slower cadence of Abbott Stokes declining to be in a hurry about anything. The conversation lasted maybe 7 minutes. Cale heard a car door. He heard the engine. He waited until the sound of it faded completely before he released the strap of his backpack. His hands were steady. He noted this with some detachment. Years of running had apparently calibrated his nervous system to a hair trigger that had learned to respond without visible expression. That night, Abbott came to his tent. He didn't sit. He stood in the opening, his large frame blocking most of the light from the fire behind him. "You have a warrant out of Fresno County," Abbott said. "Runaway. You already knew that." "Yes," Cale said. "Two officers came by looking for a boy matching your description." Cale waited. "I told them I hadn't seen any unaccompanied minors." Abbott held his gaze. "That was true enough as far as it went. You haven't been unaccompanied since you got here." A silence. "Greer showed you something in that folder," Cale said. Abbott looked at him. A pause. "Yes." Kyle looked at his hands. The tape on his right palm was beginning to lift at the edges. He pressed it back down. "He's right," he said. "Whatever he told you, he's right." Abbott didn't react to this. He simply waited with the patience of a man who understood that some things needed the space to arrive on their own. "I walked toward the car because I thought there might be something worth taking," Cale said. "I didn't know anyone was in it. I would have looked, taken whatever I found, and kept walking." He looked up at Abbott. "That's the truth." Abbott was quiet for a long moment. "I know," he said finally. "Greer told you." "Greer told me his theory. You just confirmed it." Abbott leaned against the tent pole. "You want to know what I think?" Cale waited. "I think the reason you walked toward that car doesn't matter," Abbott said. "I think the reason you stayed is the only part of the story worth talking about." He left after that without waiting for a response. Cale sat in the dark tent, listening to the camp settle into its nighttime rhythms, and thought about what it meant that a man like Abbott Stokes could make a distinction like that and mean it. He wasn't sure he believed it yet, but he recognized that it was the kind of thing that could, given enough time and evidence, become believable. He unrolled the sleeping bag. He lay down. He did not pack the bag again before he slept. What Cale had not anticipated, what nothing in his experience had prepared him for, was the texture of the days that followed. Not the dramatic architecture of crisis and decision, but the ordinary fabric of being somewhere specific with specific people who operated according to rules he didn't know yet and were not, for the most part, rushing to explain. The chapter was preparing to move a rally up in the Eastern Sierras a week out. The camp had the organized energy of a large group doing logistics, which meant there was always something happening, and also, paradoxically, always a way to be present without being noticed. Men worked on bikes, consulted maps, loaded gear into the chase van with the cargo Tetris focus of people who had done this 100 times. Cale stayed out of the way and watched, and when on the morning of the 5th day, a man named Voss dropped an alternator he was trying to move single-handedly, Cale stepped forward and took the other end without being asked. Voss looked at him. "Other side," he said, meaning the grip position. Cale adjusted. They moved it. After that, Cale was simply useful, which was the only social currency he'd ever had reliable access to, and which he understood intuitively. He didn't insert himself. He materialized at the edges of tasks that needed an extra pair of hands and applied those hands without commentary, and the men around him, being practical people who valued competence over conversation, absorbed his presence without drama. It was Sarah who changed the quality of his days. She couldn't work on the bikes, her leg wouldn't permit the positions required, so she operated instead as a kind of roving organizational force, appearing wherever something needed to be coordinated and managing it with a directness that made even the largest men step aside. She had her father's authority without her father's age to justify it, which meant she'd had to develop a sharper edge to achieve the same result, and she wore that edge comfortably, like something she'd grown into. She started talking to Cale on the afternoon of the fifth day, sitting in the shade of the chase van, with her crutches beside her and a logbook in her lap, while he worked his way through a pile of gear that needed to be sorted and repacked. "You can read maps," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd watched him with the California road map he'd pulled from his backpack. "Yes," he said. "We're going to Baker to 127 North to 178. What's the elevation change on 178 between Baker and Shoshone?" He looked at the map she held out. "Drops about 800 feet, then comes back up. The descent is on the south side." She made a note. "Tight curves. Some, more than 127. She made another note. "Where did you learn to read maps?" "I traveled a lot," Cale said. She looked at him with the expression she'd been refining over the last 2 days, the one that acknowledged the answer while also clearly registering what the answer wasn't saying. "On your own," she said. "Yes." "For how long?" "3 years." She was quiet for a moment, looking at her logbook. "I've been riding with my dad since I was 7, she said. "He used to put me on the tank in front of him before I was big enough for a seat. My mom hated it." "Where's your mom?" Cale asked. Sarah's pen stopped moving. A brief stillness. "She died when I was 12, she said. "Car accident." A pause. Different road, different desert, same kind of day. Kyle looked at the map in his hands. "I'm sorry," he said. "So is everyone," Sarah said. "It doesn't change much." But the flatness with which she said it had the quality of something that had been said many times, a sentence worn smooth by repetition into a shape that could be handled without cutting the person holding it. They were quiet together for a while. The desert wind moved through the camp, lifting grit and setting it down elsewhere. "My mom left when I was 2, Cale said. He didn't know why he said it. He hadn't said it to anyone in 3 years. The sentence arrived in the air between them before he'd consciously decided to send it. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She looked at her logbook. "Then you didn't lose her," she said finally. "You just never had her." She said it not as a correction, but as a distinction offered carefully. "That's different." He thought about this. "Yeah," he said, "it is." She looked up at him then, and the appraising expression had shifted into something that wasn't quite open but was adjacent to it, the expression of someone who had taken a measurement and found it more accurate than expected. "You're not what I thought you were," she said. Again, like the first time, but meaning something different now. "You said that already," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm saying it again because I mean it differently now." On the evening of the 6th day, Cale woke at midnight to the sound of voices. Not raised voices, not the voices of conflict. The low, deliberate voices of a private conversation happening outside Abbott's tent, which was 15 feet from Cale's. He lay still in the dark and listened, because survival had made the processing of overheard conversation as automatic as breathing. Greer's voice first. Steady, certain, making a case. He couldn't make out every word, but the shape of the argument was clear. The cadence of a man laying out a logical sequence, arriving at a conclusion, presenting it as the only reasonable course of action. Cale heard his own name once. He heard Fresno. He heard the word liability, which carried, even at this distance, with perfect acoustic clarity. Then Abbott's voice, shorter responses, less cadence, more weight. Then Greer's voice again. Harder now. The word chapter. The word vote. A long pause. Then nothing. Cale lay in the dark with his eyes open, looking at the canvas ceiling. His heart rate had elevated. He noted this without judgment, the body responding to information the conscious mind was still processing. He took a slow breath. He let the information settle. Greer was going to force a chapter vote. The chapter, not Abbott's decision alone, not a personal debt of honor, but the formal democratic machinery of the organization brought to bear on the question of whether a 15-year-old runaway with a larceny instinct and a Fresno warrant was something the California nomads could afford to have associated with them. Cale knew how that vote would go if it happened. He sat up. He reached for his backpack, which was under the cot. He pulled it out and set it on his lap and looked at it in the dark. The faded blue of it, the safety pin holding the zipper. He unzipped it. He took out the Louis L'Amour and set it on the cot. He put his arms through the straps. He walked out of the tent. The camp was dark and cold. The fire burned down to orange coals, no one moving. The air had dropped 20 degrees from the afternoon and carried the clean mineral smell of desert night. His boots were quiet on the packed earth. He moved through the sleeping camp with the practiced silence of someone who had learned early that the ability to be invisible in a crowd was worth more than almost any other skill a person could develop. He reached the edge of the camp, the point where the flat scrub began and the highway shoulder extended south into unlit desert, and he stopped. Sarah was standing there. She was on her crutches, her braced leg extended, wearing a jacket over her hospital clothes. She was not surprised to see him. She had been waiting. Kyle said nothing. He stood at the edge of the camp with the backpack on his shoulders and looked at her, and the silence between them was the silence of two people who both understood exactly what was happening and didn't need to perform confusion about it. "I knew you'd come this way," she said. Her voice was low and completely awake, the voice of someone who had not been asleep. "You should be off that leg," Cale said. "You should be in that tent," she said. He looked past her down the dark highway. The asphalt disappeared into the desert night about 50 yards out, lost in the darkness beyond the camp's outermost light. He had walked into darker than that. He had walked into much worse than that. "You heard them," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. "Some of it. And now you're going to do what you always do when something gets complicated." She shifted her weight on the crutches. "You're going to disappear." Kyle didn't answer that. He looked at the highway. "The vote's going to happen whether you're here or not," he said finally. "It doesn't need me present to come out the way it's going to come out. You don't know how it's going to come out. I have a pretty clear picture." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Her pale blue eyes were steady in the dark, the same eyes as her father, the same quality of looking at something until it stopped being able to hide. "You walk out that gate tonight," she said, "and you prove Greer right. Not about what you did at the car, about what you are." Cale went still. "He thinks you're a person who takes what's useful and disappears when the cost gets too high," she said. "He's not saying it to be cruel. He's saying it because that's what the evidence shows." She paused. "You want to give him different evidence, you stay and you face it. You run right now, and he was right all along." Kyle stood at the boundary of the camp with the dark highway behind him and the orange coals of the dying fire in front of him. He stood there for a long time, long enough that the cold worked its way through his jacket and settled into the muscles of his shoulders, which were already tired from the day's work. He thought about Greer's folder and the word liability and the vote and the arithmetic of how that vote was likely to go. He thought about all of it clearly and without sentiment, because sentiment was something he'd learned early to be suspicious of. Then he thought about Sarah standing at a camp boundary at midnight on a broken leg to intercept a boy she'd known for 6 days. He took the backpack off. He walked back into the camp. He did not look at Sarah as he passed her. He heard her crutches on the packed earth behind him moving toward her own tent at a different angle. He went back to his tent. He put the backpack under the cot. He lay down. He pulled the sleeping bag up and looked at the canvas ceiling and listened to the camp breathe around him in the dark. He did not sleep for a long time, but he stayed. The morning of the 7th day came in fast and colorless, the way Mojave mornings do not. A gradual brightening, but a sudden categorical shift from dark to light, as if the sun had been waiting just below the horizon with impatience and couldn't hold back any longer. The air was cold the way desert air is always cold before the ground has had time to start radiating yesterday's stored heat back upward. Kyle was awake before the camp. He sat outside his tent on the milk crate with his knees up and the Louis L'Amour open in his hands, though he hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. He watched the camp come to life, the first movement from a tent at the far end, a man heading toward the portable facilities with the shuffling purposefulness of someone not yet sufficiently awake for the day's first obligation. Then another. The fire was rebuilt from last night's coals. A propane stove appeared on a folding table and the smell of coffee arrived in the cold air like a civil announcement that the day was now officially beginning. He heard Greer before he saw him. Greer's footstep was distinctive, the weight of him and the way he set his heel down, first a habit that gave each step a quarter second of advance notice. Cale had cataloged this on day 2 without consciously deciding to. He kept his eyes on the book. Greer stopped a few feet away. He looked at Cale with the comprehensive, unhurried assessment of someone who had been in situations requiring accurate human evaluation and had learned to take his time getting it right. He had a coffee cup in his hand. Steam rose from it in the cold morning air. "You heard us last night," Greer said. Cale turned a page. "Some of it. Then you know what's coming." "Yes." Greer was quiet for a moment. He drank his coffee. "You understand why," he said. "It was not an apology. It was the statement of a man who had done something he would do again and wanted it understood in those terms." "You don't know me," Cale said. "You've been here 6 days and you don't know anything about me except what you found in a database and what you were able to observe, and you're trying to make a decision about something you can't fully understand on that basis." He finally looked up. "That's not wrong. That's just how it is." Greer looked at him for a long moment. His expression didn't change. He drank his coffee. "Abbott's called a meeting for this afternoon," he said. "Full chapter." "I know," Cale said. Greer studied him. "You going to run before it happens?" Cale looked at him steadily. "No," he said. Something in Greer's expression shifted, minimal, not dramatic, but real. He looked at Cale the way you look at something that has just demonstrated a property you hadn't confirmed yet. He finished his coffee. He walked away. Cale put the book in his lap. He looked at the desert. The sun was fully up now, the cold already retreating, the asphalt beginning to exhale yesterday's heat. Somewhere behind him across the camp, he could hear Sarah's crutches on the packed earth, the rhythm of her movement, which he'd cataloged without intending to. He had until afternoon. He sat with the book in his lap and the sun climbing and the camp building to its daytime volume around him. And he thought about what it meant to stay. Not just to not run, to actually stay. To walk into a room voluntarily rather than being dragged into it or stumbling through a door without knowing what was on the other side. He had spent 3 years becoming very good at leaving. He turned the page. He had not considered until this moment that becoming very good at leaving might have been preparation for knowing when the time finally came what staying was worth. The meeting was called for 2 in the afternoon. Kyle knew this because the camp had a rhythm to it now after 7 days, and he had learned to read that rhythm the way he had learned to read every environment he'd passed through, by watching what changed rather than what stayed the same. What changed starting around 10 in the morning was the quality of the movement. Men who had been loose and purposeful in their morning tasks became tighter, more deliberate. Conversations shortened. The fire was rebuilt higher than it needed to be for cooking. Men drifted toward the central clearing in the camp, the way water drifts toward the lowest point, not rushing, not announcing, just following the gradient of what the day had decided to become. Greer moved through the camp with the efficient, contained energy of a man who had set something in motion and was now simply ensuring it arrived where he directed it. Abbott was not visible. Cale sat on his milk crate and read his book, and did not read his book and watch the camp prepare itself for the afternoon. The boots he'd been given were on his feet. They fit better than anything he'd worn in a long time. He noted this with a detachment that was becoming harder to maintain. Sarah found him at noon. She came across the camp on her crutches with a plate in one hand and a water bottle tucked under her arm, managing the physics of this with the focused irritation of someone whose body had inconvenienced her and was being made to understand that this was unacceptable. She stopped in front of him and held out the plate. "Eat," she said. He took it, beans and rice and two thick slices of bread. He ate without comment. She lowered herself onto an overturned crate across from him, propped her crutches against the van behind her, and stretched her braced leg out in front of her. She watched him eat the way she watched everything, with the direct, complete attention that didn't bother to pretend it was something else. "You heard them last night," she said. "Greer asked me that already." "What did you tell him?" "That I heard some of it." She looked at him. "Are you scared?" Kyle thought about this honestly. "No," he said. "I don't think so." He considered. "I'm used to things going wrong." "This doesn't have to go wrong," Sarah said. "I know." She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the camp. "My dad won't let it go wrong," she said. But the way she said it had a quality, not reassurance exactly, but the statement of a fact she was reminding herself of as much as telling him. "It's not up to your dad," Cale said. She looked at him. He met her eyes. She looked away first, which was unusual. He'd noticed that she almost never looked away first. "No," she said. "It's not." She picked up her crutches and rose without asking for help, which he'd also noticed she never did. She looked down at him for a moment with the complicated expression that had been evolving across 7 days past. The first appraisal, past the recalibration, into something that didn't have a clean name, but that Cale thought might be the expression a person makes when they've decided to care about an outcome they can't control. "Greer's not a bad man," she said. "He's just a man who needs everything to make sense." She walked away. Cale looked down at his plate. He finished the beans and rice. He set the plate aside. He picked up his book, looked at it for a moment, and set that aside too. He looked at the central clearing where the chapter was assembling. He thought about making sense, about what it meant to be an element in someone else's system of logic, to be the variable that didn't reduce cleanly to a known quantity. Greer had a folder. The folder had facts. The facts were accurate. Cale would not have disputed a single item in that folder because every item was true. He had a warrant. He had walked toward the car with intentions that were not noble. He had years of exactly the kind of history that made cautious men reach for the exit. All of that was true, and all of that was also somehow not the whole story. He sat with this for a while. The sun moved, the camp tightened, the clearing filled. At 1:45, Cale stood up. He didn't take the backpack. He didn't take the book. He left them beside the milk crate, and he walked across the camp toward the central clearing where the chapter was assembling, where folding chairs had been arranged in rough rows, and men were settling into them with the gravity of people who understood that what happened in this space carried weight. He walked with his hands at his sides and his boots firm on the packed earth, in a quality of intention that he recognized from only a handful of moments in his life. Moments where he had made a decision not because it was safe or smart or strategically sound, but because it was the only thing he could live with doing. He heard the shift in the crowd before he was fully inside the clearing. The conversations didn't stop exactly. They became aware. The change in ambient sound that happens when a space notices something it wasn't expecting. He felt the attention the way you feel weather, as a change in pressure rather than a single identifiable sensation. He walked to the front. Greer was standing near the folding table that served as a lectern. He saw Cale coming and his expression did not change, but something in his posture adjusted a small recalibration. The posture of a man who has planned for a number of contingencies and is now determining which one has arrived. Abbott was in a chair at the edge of the clearing. He saw Cale. His face went still and very watchful. Sarah was standing at the back near the chase van, crutches under her arms, her face completely unreadable. Cale stopped at the front of the assembled men, and he turned to face them. 800 men, give or take. Some seated, some standing at the perimeter. A range of faces, old and young, weathered and sharp, closed and cautiously open. The collective attention of them was a physical thing, something that had density and texture. He had never stood in front of anything like this. He had spent 3 years perfecting the art of being invisible, of taking up less space than his actual dimensions, of passing through environments without leaving marks. He stood in the center of all of it, and he took a breath. "I'm going to say something," Kale said. His voice came out level and clear, which surprised him slightly. "And then whatever happens, happens." The clearing was quiet. The desert wind moved through it, lifting a thin layer of grit and setting it down. "I walked towards Sarah's car because I thought there was something worth taking," he said. "I'd been walking for 6 hours and I hadn't eaten since the day before, and I saw a wrecked car on an empty road, and I thought about what might have been thrown clear in the roll." He said it plainly without inflection, the way you state a fact that requires no ornamentation. "That's why I went toward it, not because I wanted to help anyone. I didn't know there was anyone to help." The silence in the clearing had a quality now, not hostile, not sympathetic, just the quality of people receiving information and making room for it. "When I got close enough to see inside, I heard her breathing," he said, "and I took 3 steps back toward the highway." He looked at the assembled faces without fixing on any one of them. "I know what Hell's Angels patches look like. I know what getting caught near a one percenter's wrecked car looks like for a kid with a warrant and no people and no story that makes sense. I know all of that. I took 3 steps back." He paused, not for effect, because the next part required him to find it accurately before he said it. "And then she screamed," he said, "and I went back." He let that sit. "I don't know how to make that sound like more than it is," he said. "I'm not going to try. I'm not going to tell you I'm a good person because I don't know if that's true. I know I've done things I'm not proud of. I know what's in that folder." A brief look toward Greer, who was watching him with the focused stillness of someone who has just encountered something outside his established categories. "Everything in it is accurate. Every item." He looked back at the assembled men. "I'm not asking to stay," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not making a case for myself. I'm just—" He stopped, searched. "I didn't want to be the only person in this conversation who was telling less than the whole truth." He looked at his boots for a moment, the leather of them still stiff enough to be unfamiliar. "I've been in enough rooms where the truth wasn't the point. I didn't want this to be one of those rooms." He stopped talking. The wind moved through the clearing. He stood with his hands at his sides and he waited, and he did not brace himself this time because there was nothing left to brace against. Whatever came next would come next. He had said the true thing in the truest way he knew how to say it, and the saying of it had a completeness he hadn't anticipated, a feeling not of relief exactly, but of reduction, of arriving at the simplest possible version of something that had been needlessly complex. He heard the sound before he understood what it was. A single pair of boots on packed earth. Deliberate. The heel-first step he had cataloged on day 2. Greer Fallon walked from his position near the table to the open space beside Cale. He stopped there. He looked out at the assembled men. He was quiet for a long moment, the way he was always quiet before he spoke, letting the silence do the preliminary work. "This kid just stood up in front of 800 men," Greer said, "and told the truth when he had no obligation to and no guarantee of what it would cost him." His voice carried without effort the voice of a man who had addressed rooms like this for 30 years. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't make excuses. He said the hard thing because it was the true thing, and because apparently that mattered to him more than the outcome. He turned his head and looked at Cale directly. His single complete eye and the scarred socket of the other fixed on Cale with an attention that was comprehensive and serious. "I've been in rooms with a lot of people," Greer said. "Men twice his age and size, men who had every institutional advantage, men who had lawyers and leverage, and nothing at stake but their pride." He looked back at the assembled chapter. "I have not seen many of them do what he just did." The clearing was absolutely still. "I was wrong about what mattered," Greer said. Simply, without self-flagellation, the way a man who has built his credibility on accuracy corrects a calculation error directly without drama, and without making the correction the centerpiece of the moment. I was looking at where he started. I should have been looking at where he stopped. He turned to face Cale fully. I'm voting to let you stay, he said. As long as Abbott's willing to stand for you, I'm not going to argue against it. He held out his hand. Cale looked at it. His throat had tightened in a way that was inconvenient and that he was going to decline to acknowledge. He reached out and shook Greer Fallon's hand, and the grip that came back was hard and brief and completely sincere. What happened next was not a formal vote. It was more like weather, the kind of unanimous atmospheric shift that happens when a large group of people reaches a conclusion simultaneously, and the conclusion travels through them as a collective physical event rather than a sequence of individual decisions. The sound that rose from the assembled men of the California Nomads chapter was not a cheer and not an announcement. It was more like an exhale, the sound of a held breath released, of a question answered to the satisfaction of the people who had been carrying it. Men began to move. Not toward Cale, exactly, more the organic reassembly of a crowd that is finished with its formal purpose and is returning to its natural state. But the direction of the movement had a quality that was unmistakably different from the assembly of an hour ago. The weight of it had changed from the weight of judgment to the weight of inclusion, which felt entirely different on the skin. Cale stood in the clearing as the chapter dispersed around him, and he breathed. He became aware after a moment that Abbott had not moved from his chair at the edge of the clearing. Everyone else had found motion, but Abbott was simply sitting there watching Cale with an expression that had no performance in it whatsoever. Just a man looking at something he needed to look at without interruption. The clearing emptied. The two of them were alone in it. Abbott stood. He was unhurried about it, unfolding his large frame from the chair with the deliberate care of a man whose body had absorbed a great deal of mileage and had learned to negotiate with gravity rather than ignore it. He crossed the clearing in 7 long strides and stopped in front of Cale. He didn't speak immediately. He looked at Cale the way he had looked at the burned-out Malibu on the first evening, with the concentrated attention of someone taking a full and accurate inventory. You didn't have to do that, Abbott said. I know, Cale said. Greer was going to force the vote either way. It might have gone differently than you thought. I know that too. Abbott nodded slowly. The late afternoon light was doing what Mojave light did at this hour, turning everything it touched into something that looked more valuable than it did at noon, as if the day was trying to apologize for itself before it left. It caught the silver in Abbott's beard, the deep lines of his face, the faded ink of the tattoos on his forearms. Why then, Abbott said, tell me what you told Sarah you couldn't tell her. Cale looked at him. I didn't tell Sarah I couldn't tell her anything. You didn't have to, Abbott said. Cale was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the empty clearing. I've been in rooms where everyone was lying, Cale said. Caseworkers and foster families and county offices and teachers and people in positions where telling the truth was part of their stated job. I've been in those rooms and I've watched the truth get managed and shaped and deployed strategically until it didn't mean anything anymore. He looked at his hands. The tape on his palm was holding. I didn't want to do that. In here. He looked up. This room felt like it was worth doing it differently. It does, sir. Abbott was quiet for a long time. Not the silence of someone formulating a response. The silence of someone receiving something and making proper room for it. You're 15 years old, Abbott said. Yes, Cale said. You sound like someone who's been keeping his own counsel for a very long time. 3 years, Cale said. Before that, I had a caseworker named Mrs. Halloran who was good at her job for about a year and then got reassigned. Before that, I don't remember much that's worth counting. Abbott absorbed this. He looked out toward the highway where the burned shell of the Malibu was still visible in the ditch, a blackened landmark that would probably stay there for months before anyone got around to moving it. Monuments to bad days tended to linger in the desert. There was no one to rush their removal. I need to ask you something, Abbott said. And I need you to understand that the answer doesn't change what happened in there. You're here and you're staying and that's done. He looked back at Cale. So the answer I'm asking for is the real one. not the strategic one. Cale waited. What do you want? Abbott said. Not from me, not from the chapter. Just what do you want? When you imagine a future that isn't just the next crossroads and the next drainage culvert to sleep in, what's in it? The question arrived in Cale's chest with a weight he hadn't anticipated. He had been asked what he wanted before, technically speaking. Caseworkers asked it in the obligatory way of a form being filled out. Foster parents asked it in the transactional way of people establishing a set of minimum requirements they could choose to meet or not. The system asked it in the aggregate, deciding what children like him statistically needed and deploying those needs as categories. Nobody had ever asked it the way Abbott asked it, with the gravity of someone who intended to treat the answer as information that mattered, as something that would be taken seriously regardless of whether it was the right answer or the convenient answer or any kind of answer at all. Cale opened his mouth and then closed it. He looked at the desert, the hard, flat immensity of it, the creosote and the cholla, and the distant mountain range gone purple in the fading light. He had crossed a substantial portion of this landscape in the last 3 years, and for most of that crossing he had been so focused on the logistics of forward motion, the next water source, the next possible shelter, the next opportunity to solve the immediate problem of the current day, that he had not allowed himself to look past the horizon. Looking past the horizon was a luxury for people who had a fixed point to look from. I don't know, he said. He said it without apology or self-consciousness, the way you state a fact that is simply true. I've never had enough stability to figure out what I'd want from stability. That sounds circular. It doesn't, Abbott said. I know how to survive, Cale said. I know how to be invisible. I know how to move and how to read people, and how to make myself useful before someone decides I'm a liability. He stopped. I don't know what any of that's for when survival isn't the immediate requirement. Abbott nodded, the slow, receptive nod of a man receiving information he's been waiting for without knowing he was waiting for it. That's an honest answer, he said. You asked for the real one, Cale said. I did. Abbott was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm going to call a lawyer tomorrow morning. A good one, a man who has been solving problems for this chapter for 22 years. He's going to look at what's on your record and tell me what it costs to make it go away. A pause. It'll go away. Records from Fresno County for a 15-year-old with no priors and no violence go away when the right person files the right paperwork. Cale looked at him. Why would you do that? Because it needs doing, Abbott said, and because I can. That's not a sufficient reason by itself. Abbott looked at him for a long moment. No, he said. It's not. He was quiet. My wife's name was Caroline. She died 7 years ago, not a car accident, just the ordinary kind of death that people don't make stories out of, which is somehow worse. She was the kind of person who did things because they needed doing. He looked at the desert. I've been trying to be more like her ever since. I'm not very good at it, but I keep trying. The wind moved through the clearing, picking up grit and carrying it south. The light was nearly horizontal now, the shadows long. After the lawyer sorts things out, Abbott said, we'll talk about what comes next. Not tonight. Tonight you just know it exists. He looked at Cale steadily. There are options between a drainage culvert and a motorcycle club. Real ones. But that's a conversation for another day. Cale looked at him. He looked at the big weathered face, the pale blue eyes, the same eyes as Sarah, the same unusual shade that didn't read quite right against the hard landscape he inhabited, and he did the thing he had been trained by years of hard experience never to do. He looked for the calculation behind the kindness. He looked for the exit condition, the asterisk, the clause that would kick in when the debt was satisfied and the obligation lifted. He didn't find it, which was the most frightening thing that had happened to him in 7 days, including the car fire. Okay, he said. It was barely a sound. Abbott reached out and put his hand on Cale's shoulder. Not a grip, just a weight. The simple, massive, unambiguous weight of a hand placed on a shoulder because the person whose hand it was wanted to place it there. It lasted 3 seconds, and then it was gone. Tonight you eat something, Abbott said. He walked away toward the camp, and Cale stood in the empty clearing as the light went from amber to copper to the deep blue-gray of desert dusk, and he let the silence of the place be exactly what it was, not threatening, not demanding, not weighted with the immediate and specific requirements of survival. Just silence, just the desert, just the sound of his own breathing even in slow going in and out without urgency. He had not stood in silence like this in 3 years without calculating his exit. He stood in it now and did not calculate anything. After a while, he walked back through the camp toward his tent. The fire was built up for the evening men gathered around it in the loose social formation of people settling in for the night. Someone was playing a harmonica somewhere in the dark, not a song exactly, just a melody feeling its way forward one note at a time. He passed Greer, who was standing at the edge of the firelight with a cup of coffee and his eyes on the middle distance. Greer looked at him as he passed. Cale looked back. Neither of them said anything. It was the kind of exchange that didn't need words, the acknowledgement of two people who have arrived at a mutual understanding through a process that was not comfortable for either of them, and who have agreed without discussing it that the process is finished. Sarah was sitting on a camp chair near his tent. Her braced leg extended a lantern on the ground beside her, throwing a circle of yellow light. She had a notebook in her lap and a pen in her hand, but she wasn't writing. She was watching him cross the camp with an expression that had shed most of its hard edges. He stopped in front of her. "How'd it go?" she said. "Greer voted to keep me," he said. Something moved across her face, relief, but organized into something she wasn't going to make visible. Something she was going to let him see just the edge of and no more. "I know," she said. "Word travels fast." "Then why are you asking?" "I wanted to hear how you'd tell it," she said. He sat down on the milk crate. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the firelight moved across both of them, and the harmonica somewhere in the dark found something that was beginning to sound like a real melody. "My dad's going to call the lawyer tomorrow," she said. "He told me." "Falconer is good," she said. "He's been fixing things for the chapter since before I was born. He'll sort out the warrant." A pause. "After that, it's going to get complicated. Legal guardianship, county filing, school enrollment. My dad doesn't do complicated paperwork well. He does complicated situations well. The paperwork is going to need someone to push it through." "You," Cale said. She looked up. "Maybe," she said. "Definitely," he said. "You're the only one in this camp who would actually follow through on paperwork." The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something more controlled than that, something she was permitting rather than producing. "You've been here 7 days," she said. "I pay attention," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Yeah," she said. "You do." She reached beside her chair and picked up something from the ground, a paper bag folded at the top, the bottom weighted. She held it out. "These are yours." He took it, opened it. Inside was a pair of boots, not the ones he was wearing, which had been someone else's, and handed over without comment. These were new, still in the tissue paper. The clean smell of new leather that he associated with stores he had only ever looked into from outside. He looked at her. "You needed boots," she said. The tone was completely flat, as if the logic of the action was so self-evident that inflection would be an overstatement. "I have boots," he said. He looked at the ones on his feet. "Those were Voss's brothers," she said. "These are yours, nobody else's, first." He looked at the boots in the bag. The good leather of them, the clean stitching, the weight of something made to last. He thought about the canvas sneakers in the Mojave ditch with their soles peeling off, which had carried him as far as they could carry him, and no farther, which had literally melted against the side of a burning car. They had been exactly adequate to the requirements of the life he'd been living, and completely inadequate to any other kind. He set the bag down carefully. He looked at his hands. "Sarah," he said. "Don't," she said. Immediate certain. "Don't say thank you. Don't explain why you're saying thank you. Don't make it something that requires a response." She looked at him steadily. "Just put them on." He looked at her for a long moment. He reached into the bag and took out the boots. He unlaced Voss's brother's boots and set them aside, and he pulled on the new ones, lacing them slowly in the circle of lantern light. The leather stiff and exact, and completely his in the way that things are yours when they arrive. Without history, without someone else's shape already worn into them, without anyone else's debt attached. He stood up, tested the ground with them. The fit was right better than right, precise. He looked at Sarah. She was looking at her notebook again, pen in hand, as if she had simply been waiting for him to finish a task before she returned to her own. As if the moment had been exactly as small as it needed to be and not a molecule larger. He sat back down on the milk crate. The harmonica in the dark had found its song fully. Now something slow and without urgency, the kind of melody that didn't want to go anywhere in particular, and was content to make the distance between here and there feel worthwhile. "What are you writing?" Cale asked. "Route planning," she said. "For after, when my leg is right. For the Sierras rally. For everything after the Sierras rally," she said. She looked up. "It's a long road. Someone should know where it goes." He looked at the fire, at the men gathered around it, the leather and the denim and the scarred hands, and the faces that had seen a great deal and were content to have seen it. At the desert beyond the circle of firelight, which was enormous and dark and full of the kind of nothing that was also, depending on how you stood in it, everything. "Yeah," he said, "someone should." They sat in the lantern light while the fire burned and the harmonica played and the desert night settled around the camp with the immense patient weight of something that had been here long before any of them and would be here long after. And in that particular silence, in that specific circle of light, Cale Dryden sat still for the first time in 3 years and felt the strange, unfamiliar, entirely tolerable weight of being somewhere he was allowed to be. He did not think about the next crossroads. He did not calculate the distance to the nearest exit. He sat in his new boots on a milk crate in the Mojave Desert, and he let the night be exactly what it was, and that was enough. And tomorrow would have its own requirements, and he would meet them when they came. And for now there was the fire and the harmonica and Sarah's pen moving quietly in the lantern light, and the boots on his feet that belonged to nobody but him.